evening, everyone. Welcome to the third and final talk in our March History Lecture Series. We have, as you know, focused on the Civil War this time around, and we've had very interesting speakers who have presented some nice presentations. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Al, who, as you know, is our historian, who happens to be in this office most days. We love sharing the territory with him, and it's a real pleasure to share this evening with him. And Al.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you for coming out tonight to hear our program. We're doing this program in two parts. The first part will be me, and the second part will be some really entertaining folks. I want to open up tonight's talk just to go back a year, because we have been dealing with the Civil War celebration for our talks. And I don't know if there were some of you who were here last year to hear Mike Russet talk about the Battle of Gettysburg and its impact on the civilian population of Gettysburg, which was a really interesting talk, because sometimes we forget about the people who lived there. We're so intent on learning about the battles. And I finished up that series talking about slavery and the gradual abolition of slavery in Salem and across the country, leading into the Civil War. This year we had Abraham Lincoln visit us. Phil Jessen came and did a marvelous program about Abraham Lincoln. Looked very much like old Abe. Second speaker this year was Mike Russet, who came to talk to us about the New York State militia and its developing into the New York State National Guard. But it was also the group of men who in the militia who then became many of our soldiers in the Civil War regiments that we know about and have heard about. Tonight I'm going to talk about Salem in the Civil War. Primarily, the 123rd Volunteers were raised in Salem, but I'm going to take us back to the year of 1861, because before that regiment was organized in Salem, there were many people, soldiers in Washington County, who volunteered for other organizations, infantry, artillery, and Navy. Well, we're going to stick with the land forces when we talk about this, but I wanted to give you an idea of what happened that the year before, since so many of our Washington County people, and I'm looking out in the audience, and I know there are some people here who probably have ancestors who were in the Civil War. So I'm glad to see that you are here. Now, on April 12, 1861, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. The war had opened up in the South, firing on Fort Sumter. And the first battle that was to take place, of course, was the Battle of Bull Run. Now, local volunteers from Salem, Cambridge, Greenwich, Fort Edward, Whitehall, Sandy Hill, Granville, and Argyle all had volunteers join a number of different organizations. The first one I want to mention is called the 22nd New York Infantry. There were 8 companies in this regiment, and 4 came from Washington County. Now, the 22nd fought in the first battle of Bull Run on August 22nd, 1862, and they were badly mauled at that battle. The realization that this was not going to be a short war set in very quickly, because we soon realized that the tactics and the military training of the Union troops did not compare to the training and the leadership that the Southern troops had at Bull Run. And so it was a terrible defeat for Union forces at Bull Run. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Manassas. If you have, I've been there, and it really is an emotional experience to go to that place and to walk those fields knowing that, people from your hometown were there. And to see the monuments and the fields, and also to imagine in your mind the fact that the people from the outlying territory of Manassas drove their carriages and wagons to watch the battle. And what they watched was a huge artillery battle with most of the Union troops, the 22nd being wiped out at that battle. Now, the 22nd was then sent on to go to Chancellorsville. And if you know anything about Chancellorsville, you'll know that that was a terrible Union loss also. So by the end of Chancellorsville, the 22nd had lost so many men that they just disbanded the 22nd and either sent them home or they could join other organizations. But there just weren't enough of them left to continue. Another organization was the 93rd Infantry, again, volunteers, and this group was organized by John Crocker of Cambridge. And the 92nd fought throughout the war. It ended its service under General Philip Sheridan, and they fought their way with the Army of the Potomac. And they got mustered out around June 29th in 1865. Cavalry was a very important element in the Civil War, and Salem did have its own cavalry unit. Colonel Solomon Russell of Salem organized the unit as the 2nd Cav. And the 2nd Cav was known as the Black Horse Cavalry, and it organized and went to Washington, D.C., where it defended Washington until it was mustered out on March of 1862. It did not have a long life. By that time, the Union soldiers, generals, staff decided that they had more than enough cavalry soldiers. So they disbanded this group. And the men who were in that group transferred to other regiments. Colonel Russell did not, however. Colonel Russell returned to Salem and rejoined a New York State militia group. And he was in that group for a couple of years until he transferred to the Federal 1st Division 6th Corps as a staff officer to his cousin. And his cousin was General David Allen Russell, who grew up here in Salem, went to Washington Academy, and then went to West Point. And I'm going to talk more about David Allen Russell a little later on in my talk. But I want to show you something. I brought some exhibits. The 16th Regiment of Artillery, which was raised in Sandy Hill, had Salem, Hebron, the surrounding towns in that artillery organization. Now, we all know that during the Civil War, people wrote letters, and I'm sure you have read a lot of those letters, but I have an example. Here's the kind of envelope, for example, that a soldier might carry in his backpack, or that somebody from home might have sent him. Very small. This one happens to have engraved right on it, the 16th Regiment New York Volunteer Artillery. And this is the actual letter that was in that envelope. And this was written by a McCloy, who happened to be a relative of Bruce Ferguson in Hebron. McCloy was from Hebron, lived on Chamberlain Mills Road. Bruce tells me that the house that he lived in it's gone. It's not on that road anymore. But I will read that letter to you. This is a letter from James McCloy to his sister, Elizabeth McCloy. And this is the letter that I have it in my hand that I just showed you. It says, "Dear sister, I sit down to write you a few lines. I am well, and I hope on the arrival of these few lines may find you the same. I have not much time to spare, so you must excuse this short note. I have had some very hard times since we left Yorktown. I was in a fight near Malvern the other day, but I am all right yet. Give my love to all my friends in Hebron, and write soon. I do not believe we can ever whip the rebels, as they beat us every day. I wish the war could be stopped, for I am very sick of seeing so many of our brave men shot down, and nothing gained. We are now camped on the south sides of the James River. 2 of the rebel rams, a ram is a type of cannon, in sight, and I think they will soon shell our camp, so I must close this. Write soon, and so write me all the news. No more at present from your affect brother, James McCloy. And then he has a P.S. My hand shakes so that I do not hardly believe you can read this, but under the circumstances you must excuse me. Give my love to Mary Jane and tell her to write. Now I want to go into the 123rd. It was in July of 1862 that they realized there just weren't enough soldiers. So Abraham Lincoln called for 300,000 volunteers. Now you notice I keep using the word volunteers because that's what they were. At that time there was no draft. The draft comes later, 1863. But until this time, the volunteers were coming from the New York State militias. However, if you were here for Mike Russett's talk, you realize that a lot of the New York State militia companies were paper companies. They were not well trained at all. In fact, he said a lot of them were just party organizations. But yet, one of the ways to get volunteers was to appeal to them. The patriotic fervor, fortunately at that time, did not all come from the militia. It came from the rest of the community. The federal draft that did come along a year later was for ages 20 to 45. And I'd like to point out that there was a bounty paid in Washington County when they raised the 123rd in order to get men to volunteer. They said, we'll give you $50, which at that time was a lot of money, if you will enlist. And many of them did. I have the original enlistment record not here tonight with me, but it's in our archives. And I was looking at it the other day, looking at all the names on that list, realizing that a good share of those people who signed it with an X. In other words, they could not read and they could not write. Somebody signed for them at that time. That's the situation that existed. Now I'm going to read to you a little bit about the civilian life during the war. We hear a lot about the battles, but we don't hear an awful lot about what was happening at home. I think we all know that in the South it was really terrible because all the battles were fought in the South. And the South was not as in an industrial region like the North was. They relied on selling cotton and exporting it to England. And when the war broke out, the Union set up their naval barricade. They had a difficult time getting things out and getting things in. So life in the South was very difficult. Life in the North was not quite as bad, and it did go on. But yet, when you look at the newspapers of those periods, you discover that most of the newspaper articles of that period were about the war. And so every day when people, or every week when they opened up the newspaper would be full of who was killed. Very explicit description. So-and-so was killed, bullet through the head. So-and-so had his leg blown off, died in the hospital. You knew how they were killed, but that's the way things were written back in those days. But life did go on, and I'll just read a little bit to you about some of the things that were taking place. The men were away. So instead of the men working in the industrial factories and mills in the North, the women and children took over those jobs. And they earned money while their husbands and brothers were away fighting. Many women took roles that they wouldn't normally have. Nursing became a career at that time. Up to that point, women did not have many careers they could go into. But the Civil War demanded doctors and nurses. And that particular career opened up to them. Some people took in soldiers who had been wounded and nursed them in their own homes. But you had nurses like Dorothy Dix and Clara Barton and Sally Tompkins and Phoebe Pember, who were noted for their contributions to society. Nurses performed so well during the war that, as I've said, it became a suitable career after the war. When the northern cities grew, so did the services the city offered. Before the Civil War, each town had a sheriff or a constable or a police chief. After the Civil War, that role became open to returning veterans who then took on the jobs of being members of a much larger police force. So the training that they got in the service became a way to make a living after the war. Children continued to go to school, although the school textbooks were really solid books of patriotism. Everything the children read in their textbooks dealt with patriotism for the country. And also, the Confederacy did the same thing. They stopped using textbooks that were published in the North, and they started publishing their own textbooks to promote their patriotism. The lessons, I wanted to read this to you because it's interesting. The lessons in the school books, like the Union ABC school book, focused on the loyalty to the Union and moral values. And they had sayings like, O is part of the ABC, so O is an officer proud of his nation, and P is the president who rules this great nation. So at that time, we used the system of rhyme and poetry and music to educate our children in school and about the way of life. Now the boys, many of the boys were in the Civil War. I don't know whether you're aware of that or not, but according to my statistics here, 40,000 northern boys between the ages of 7 and 9 or older, depending on what they were going to do, became drummer boys. Now, drummer boys were not on the battle line primarily. They would be sent back to the rear. They would work in the kitchen. But drummer boys were important, and I'll talk about drummer boys a little later. But they would do odd jobs like gathering wood, water, caring for horses, but you could not consider them soldiers, especially those that were between 7 and 9 years old. If you were a professional soldier and a drummer, then you would be older, of course. You would be 18, 19, 20, so on. Now in the North, the children also helped support, just as we all remember from World War II, or most of us anyway. They would send letters to the soldiers and packages with correspondence and envelopes and things of that sort. Soap, clothing, knitted socks, mittens, any of those things that would help to cheer up the soldiers in the war. There was also in the North they would hold fairs called United States Sanitary Commissions, and basically it was an organization intended to develop military hospitals and help the diet and the health of the soldiers. And children would sell cakes and pies and jams and towels and homemade goods for that particular purpose. A lot of the things that were done in the Civil War sort of end up being done again in World War I and in World War II, and even today. We're still doing the same thing for our veterans. We have organizations that collect things. There's an organization here in Salem that collects many items and sends them to the troops overseas. So public service and public interest in helping our soldiers to, have some semblance of normal life continues. And that's always part of our patriotism. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in 1863, once the Union realized that they were running out of volunteers, which we were, the president and the legislation said, we have to have a draft. And so they passed a law saying that we would have a draft, and boys and men between the ages of 18 and 45 became draft eligible. That was not a happy time. If any of you ever saw the movie Gangs of New York, any of you see that movie? Basically, in the movie The Gangs of New York, they depict the battles that those men who were supposed to be inducted into the service had with the police. A lot of them were Irish. The Irish felt they were being picked on because a lot of them were being drafted, but the movie tells a pretty good story about what happened in New York City. The movie, fictional movie, but based on fact. Here's an announcement that was in the Salem Press. How to avoid the draft. The War Committee of the Town of Salem hereby offer to pay to any person liable to draft said town to enable him to get a substitute. The following sums: $150 for 1 year's man, $300 for a 2 year's man, and $450 for a 3 years man. This assistance to be paid by the cashier of the Bank of Salem to the first 10 who shall furnish, substitute, and deposit a certificate that proper credit therefore has been given to the town on or before December 31st, 1864. This sort of rubbed salt into the wound of those men who were drafted, had to go, to realize that somebody who had money could buy his way out of the service. So it was a real problem, but this was our first initial attempt at having a draft. And many people did buy their way out of going into the service. They would just hire somebody to go in their place. I'll pay you such and such, you go, pretend you're me. And that happened often. Now in Washington County, when the 123rd was organized, there were 10 towns. And they took, more than 10 towns. There were 10 companies. They took all the towns in the county and assigned them to a company. Here on the back wall, we have Company C. Somebody after the war, some entrepreneur said, I think I could make $1 by publishing the company roster. So they did. Salem was Company H. The names of those people in Company H are hanging on the bookcase back there. The odd thing is, I think Company H is in the Historical Society in Cambridge, and we have Company C, which I think is Cambridge. But that happens. Things get shifted around, or somebody who was in the Cambridge company left his with Cambridge. Somebody who was in a different company left it someplace else. Now, the regiment was organized. Recruitment actually took place in Hartford. There was a recruitment building in Hartford. I think some of you probably have been there. But we also recruited here in Salem, and you could be sworn in Salem, right? Well, if you know where Evergreen Bank used to be, now it's called Bank 1, TD North. Recruits were sworn in that building. That building was the home of Alexander McDougall, who was the colonel of the regiment. So we had people being sworn in both places. But the bivouac area was here in the village, and it was called Camp Washington. It was next to the railroad tracks. And there they built large sheds in which to house the recruits. And they had other tents and things so that they could feed that number of people. So we did have 10 companies that were organized. And once the companies were organized and the regiment enlistment was full, they got word that they were to ship out. And I want to read some material sort of describing their leaving town. We didn't leave town by bus, of course. We left town by train because that was the most efficient method and, in a way, the only method to travel long distances at that time. And here's what the Salem Press reported. It was not positively known until the day previous that the regiment would leave on Friday. But with no short notice, thousands collected to see it off. Early Friday morning, teams began to arrive, freighted, some with spectators only, but more with friends of soldiers who came to give a parting blessing and bid Godspeed in your mission to the men. And they continued to arrive until late in the afternoon, when our streets near the campground presented a dense mass of human life, all eager to improve the short time which remained before the regiment took up its line march. Little was done in the camp on Friday except to visit with friends, pick up, and prepare to leave. There were some sword presentations to officers, however, which added a little to the enthusiasm of the men, and at evening, 2 banners, the Stars and Stripes and our state flag with its glorious motto, Excelsior, were presented to the regiment and its colonel, that being Colonel McDougall. The presentation speech made by the Honorable Charles Hughes and the reply by Colonel McDougall. Both speeches were fair and well received. The cars being ready, the regiment went aboard and was soon on its way. As the train left the depot, cheer upon cheer went up for you brave soldiers, which was responded to by the regiment again and again, until the train passed out of hearing. The train arrived in New York City Saturday afternoon and left there on Sabbath afternoon at 5 o'clock to go to Washington, D.C. Now, Dr. Asa Fitch, our most prominent historian and first historian, wrote down his recollections in his notes. And he talks about the evening that the train had left. He said, after a clear, warm, dry day comes a bright moonlight night, 15 minutes before 11 o'clock. For the past 10 minutes, I've been listening to the roar of the long train of cars in the still night air as it started from the village, the approach down White Creek Valley, and then turning, receded up between the wood-clad hills of the Battenkill, the roar of the revolving car wheels ever and anon broken by the shrill whistle at the Divot Road crossings. The shouts of the men, for a while, distinctly audible above the roar of the cars. That roar becoming more and more faint, it has now expired as they are passing the base of the hills beyond Shushan, and I have heard the last sound I shall hear from the 1,000 young men who have gone forth from our midst to fight their country's battles. So it's sort of rather a romantic description of the train heading out of Salem towards Shushan and then wending its way down to New York City. Now, after they had some training in Washington, D.C., the 123rd was assigned to the Army of the Potomac. And their first battle was at Fredericksburg. And on April 27, 1863, they took on the Confederate soldiers and again were practically annihilated. It was a terrible defeat for the Union forces. Again, pointing out that the Confederates had better leadership, better commanders, and their men were better trained than the North soldiers were at that point. From there, they went to Round Top, which was at Gettysburg. And at Gettysburg, they were not in the center of the battle. They were mostly a reserve group, but they were on the end of the line near Round Top and did have some action. But Gettysburg was the first time they had a victory. As we all know, it was one of the major turning point in the war, probably at that time. But they did have service at Gettysburg. And for those of you who are interested in what they did at Gettysburg, it's a 3-volume book put out by the state called New York State at Gettysburg. And of course, the 123rd is mentioned often in that particular book. So you get a good idea of what battles they were in at that time. Now, in 1864, they became attached to General Hooker's 20th Corps. General Hooker was sort of a unique person. Up until that time, every battle he was in, he lost. And there was a lot of talk about cashiering him because he just didn't appear to be a good general. But then things turned around for General Hooker. He really became what we call one of our most important generals during the Civil War. Now, in 1864, the 123rd fought at Dallas under Hooker. And it was here that Archibald McDougall, who is here in this portrait, received a terrible wound. He received a minie ball in the knee and was taken from the field and sent to Chattanooga, where they had hoped he would recover, but he did not. So that was the first big major loss for the 123rd, was the death of its commander. And I want to read to you this particular bit about the death of Colonel McDougall. And this was written, Eyewitness Sergeant John Gourley of Company D. And he goes on to say, amazingly, the 123rd New York had charged to within a few feet of the enemy's cannon. And he says, Lieutenant Cruikshank said, being so near and on the side hill, the enemy could not depress their cannon so as to take us. Our men would lie on their backs, load their guns, roll over and fire. Cruikshank didn't lie down but used a tree for cover. He was grazed in the arm by grape shot, but suffered only a little bruise. The initial artillery blast caught Colonel McDougall in the right leg. He called for help, and some soldiers carried him to the rear. His right leg was shattered. Colonel McDougall underwent surgery, And Assistant Surgeon Kennedy, who was a local doctor of the 123rd New York, amputated his right leg in the lower section of the thigh. McDougall was then transported to the Officers' Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. At this stage of the war, the military hospital trains had special cars for transporting the wounded. The cars were equipped to handle stretchers along each side, and the stretchers were then hung from rubberized loops in order to try to stop all the jolting and crashing that sometimes takes place on railroad cars. The wound was a bad one, and his wife did leave Salem to visit him at his bedside. She got there just before he died because on June 23rd, he died from his wounds. Now, replacing Colonel McDougall was James Rogers from Sandy Hill. He took over as commander of the 123rd at that time. The 123rd continued all the way to Savannah, actually, on the march to Georgia. And they were at that time with General William Sherman. They left Hooker's command, joined Sherman's group. And Sherman liked them so much, he called them his pets. And they carried that name with them, called Sherman's Pets, the 123rd. But they saw a lot of action, and I'm going to read to you a letter from a Thomas Mahaffey, who lived in Hebron. And Thomas Mahaffey wrote on, again, the same kind of stationery that I showed you, except in his stationery had a little poem on it, which was typical of the time. When you bought stationery that had been printed someplace else, they always seemed to include a poem or one of the songs that hopefully we will hear later on this evening. But here he is writing to Sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth, my sheets are so small. Again, small envelope, small piece of paper. I will have to use but 2. I hope you will not be offended. I have some more to write. I would like to know how James is getting along. That's James McCloy. I have not heard from him in a long time, so when you write, let me know all about him. The weather is very pleasant for camp life. I am very anxious for my time to be out, but perhaps I will enlist again, which is not uncommon. Many soldiers, when their time was up, did re-enlist. I see that is generally the case with old soldiers. I am not certain what I will do, but I think our country will not need money men by the time we are discharged. I think and that's a misspelling, I think he meant many men. We suffered more in this company than anyone ever had. There was hardly a day, but when we had to make through water that was about 4 feet deep, through swamp, and it was a very disagreeable march, but I think Sherman's army has done something that no one army ever done in modern times. We started with 20 days rations, and the rest we had to forage off the country. There was very little left on our route. Almost every house was destroyed by flames after the soldiers took all they wanted out of it. I felt sorry to see helpless women and children left without a bite to eat or a roof over their heads. But I did not indulge in this cruel practice myself with their husbands and brothers were in war against us. I think South Carolina ought to be punished, but I cannot bear to look on such treatment to women and children who can show no resentment. I cannot explain how I feel, but South Carolina is a very poor state. The portion that the 20th Corps passed through is nothing but swamps covered with pine, once in a while sand, and the people are not enlightened like the northern people. I must bring this to a close. And he signs off. So it gives you an idea of, of what he was experiencing at that time. Now, another letter was from a Charles Rassi. You may recognize that name. This was a Vermonter. And this letter was written from near Goldsburg, near the end of the war. And again, he's writing to his sister. And he says, we have not had but 2 battles with the rebels since we left Savannah. And the wounded in our encampment were 4, and not any killed. The wounded were Peter Bushy, Sergeant Company E, wounded left arm and left side, not too dangerous. And he talks about some other wounded soldiers. Since we have left Savannah, we've had a great time living on the country. We have had everything the heart could wish for: sweet potatoes, flour, meat, chicken, and I never saw as much pork in my life as there was through on this march, and molasses and apple butter and everything that a soldier could ask for. Now remember, this is near the end of the war, and rations are becoming more available. There was an order here to the regiment to be ready to move on the 10th of April. I think we'll go to Richmond, Virginia, which is 160 miles from here. And he talks about a description of the country. Again, he says, it's a low, swampy country covered in pitch pine. Once in a while we'd come across a clearing of a few acres. And then we would scare out about 200 or 300 Negroes from 2 days old to 100 years old. And it was quite a sight. And then you ought to see them pick up their duds and set them on their head, follow the Yankees off. And most likely the next day, we will see them going back home to see old Nassau. I think there has been a great many white and black people starved to death in South Carolina since we have come through here. And he signs it, Brother Charles W. Racy. He happens to be a relative, an ancestor of Jim Tyler, who grew up here in Salem, and it was Jim who sent me this letter when he heard that I was going to be doing this talk. Now, of course, we come to the end of the war, and General Lee, of course, surrenders at Appomattox. 123rd is mustered out, and they are sent to New York. 123rd went out with 1,095 men, and it returned with 525 men. H Company, Salem Company, had 87 men in it, and it returned with 47. 40 of the 87 were either killed or wounded and died of their wounds at that time. Okay, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about not the 123rd, but about the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, 6th Corps, hero of Salem. I mentioned the name of David Allen Russell earlier. David Allen Russell, again, went to Salem Washington Academy, went to West Point, and then eventually went west. He went west with Philip Sheridan. They were friends for 4 years at West Point. And out west, they fought in the Mexican War. They fought in the Indian Wars. And when the Civil War broke out, they both decided they would side with the Union, being Northerners, because Philip Sheridan was from Troy, and David Allen Russell was from Salem. Unfortunately, David Allen Russell did not survive the war. In leading his troops, he was killed at Winchester on September 19, 1864. And a traditional story is that Colonel Solomon Russell helped to carry his body from the field. Remember I said he was on the staff of the 6th Corps at that time. And Philip Sheridan came to Salem to attend David Russell's funeral. David Russell is buried in our Evergreen Cemetery, right next to our what we call Soldiers Monument. And here I pinned up on the wall some photographs of the Soldiers Monument in Evergreen Cemetery. If you have never seen that monument, you should take a drive up there because it is very impressive. And there are something like 80 Civil War soldiers that are buried in the area of that monument. I'll read quickly just an excerpt about how David Russell died. It was at Cold Harbor, and the rebels had broken through the line, and Russell said, somebody must go out there at once. And so he took his division against the advanced foe. And while giving orders, leading his division, he was shot. He received a bullet in the right side, inflicting a mortal wound. But he stayed on his horse and continued to lead his troops against the enemy until an artillery shell burst in the air and the shrapnel killed him instantly. Just two last notes about David Russell. David Russell was honored with a fort. A fort was named for him. In 1867, Fort David Russell was built in Crow Creek Crossing, which is now today's Cheyenne, Wyoming, and it was built to protect the railroad from Indians at that time. What is there now? The Warren Air Force Base is there now. And in 1904, Russell was again honored with a battery of 2 cannons at Fort Stevens on the Columbia River in Oregon. Now, an interesting thing about the two batteries, they had two cannons, two 10-inch cannons built in Watervliet at the Watervliet Arsenal. The really interesting thing is that during World War II, this was the only fort in the contiguous United States that was fired upon by a Japanese submarine. They fired on the fort, but no damage was done. None of the shells hit the battery or did any damage on the rest of the camp. Did the battery fire back? Would have been. They didn't. They had 10-inch guns. The submarine was out of range, so they never replied to that attack. The battery today is a museum, and it still carries the name of the D.A. Russell Battery. Okay, I'm going to talk about some other things that are more specific to what was going on in the Civil War. And I will go through them quickly for you so that we can get to the best part of the program. Relief organizations. As I mentioned, during the Civil War, there were a number of them. The Red Cross. We had the nurses, led by Dorothy Dix. We had Ladies' Aid Auxiliaries that made bandages and bedclothes and uniforms, shelter halves, towels, things of that sort. The United States Christian Commission supplied chaplains and ministers and other religious things like Bibles, writing paper to the soldiers. We had the Colored Union Society that gave support to the displaced slaves. We heard about them in the letter that, there were hundreds of them just wandering around at that time, and they needed assistance. Religion in the Civil War. Religion was a very important factor in the patriotism that took place in the North. For many years, the churches had spoken about anti-slavery laws, trying to abolish slavery, and people just grew up with this. If you went to church, that's what you heard. Each regiment had a chaplain. The chaplain for the 123rd was Henry Gordon from Cambridge. There were Sunday services, and many soldiers carried Bibles. Chaplains also helped soldiers that could not read and write. Remember, I said a lot of the signatures on the primary source that I saw had X's next to the name, meaning they could not write. So the chaplain and other people would sit down with the soldiers and have the soldier dictate a letter, and they would write it out for them. Union issue food, not very good. In one letter we heard about the soldiers saying, the food's great now, we're near the end of the war and we have all we want to eat. But in the meantime, the issue food was hardtack, salted meat, mostly pork, coffee, sugar, vinegar, fruit, some vegetables, and anything else that was sent from home, or anything else that they could forage or steal. And there was a lot of stealing that took place on both sides because food was scarce. What did our soldiers wear? Well, again, the North was quite industrialized, so the making of uniforms was a rather simple thing, but they were made of wool. And they had a cap. They also had a belt with a cap box on it, a cartridge box, a bayonet with a scabbard. Carried a knapsack that would have some socks in it, writing paper, stamps, envelopes, ink, a pen, a razor, toothbrush, and a comb, and whatever else they could fit in there. They'd have a blanket, a shelter half, a canteen, some tinware for eating, and a pair of boots and shoes. The boots and shoes and the uniform until they wore out. Then if they wore out, they probably had nothing because we didn't have the supply situation that we know now in the service. Back then, supplying our troops was a very difficult thing to do. Weaponry. One of the unusual things about this war was that the weapons outdistanced the tactics. Both sides were still using Napoleonic methods of war. Go out into a field with your cannon or your men, stand in a line, and shoot at each other. And the reason that was done because the smoothbore muskets that were used at that time were not very accurate. They were good for about 300 yards, and that was it. So you would just aim the thing and hope you hit somebody. And if you could see them through the cloud of smoke, because it was black powder. And once you fired that, you had the huge cloud of black powder. Well, soon after the war started, both sides realized that they needed better weapons. And the Union came by with something called the new Springfield musket. The Springfield musket did not use a flintlock as such. It used a powder cap and a mini ball in a paper cartridge that had a measured dose of powder and a ramrod, which meant you could fire it faster, and it could even be used in wet weather. Other weapons used were the Spencer and Henry repeater rifles, and the cavalry soldiers carried a smaller weapon called a carbine, the Burnside carbine. The Confederate soldiers, who really wished the English would come in on the war on their side, but it never happened, used the British Enfield rifle with a bayonet and a sniper rifle with a Wentworth, which was the Wentworth rifle. We seldom think about the fact that snipers were as important in the Civil War as they are today. And that's the one thing most of the soldiers dreaded, because snipers did have better weaponry. Now, the big guns were cannon. Most of the cannons were called Napoleon 6 and 12 pounders. They were brass cannon, Napoleon style, used a round ball, direct fired, mounted on an oak carriage, and they were pulled by horses. There were different kinds of cannon shots, in case you're wondering. A solid shot was just a solid iron ball. You didn't want to get in the way of it. There was a shell with a fuse that exploded overhead, which distributed shrapnel. And there was another one called the case shell, which contained small round balls and a fuse to explode overhead. And the canister contained iron round balls, and it was fired point blank at infantry at short range and was very devastating. It was like a huge shotgun. For long range cannon, we have howitzers and mortars which lobbed shells high over, and if they wanted to shoot over a hill or into an enemy camp, that's what they would use. Medicine and surgery. Medicine, of course, was very important because the weaponry was so advanced and the tactics so poor that you had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who were either killed or wounded from it. The 123rd had its surgeons. John Moneypenny and I.W. Kennedy were from Cambridge, and Richard Connolly from Easton. Only 1 in 4 soldiers survived in the Civil War. 620,000 died. 360,000 in the North and 260,000 in the South. The mini ball caused terrible wounds just because it was a lead bullet that would expand when it was shot. Amputation was prominent. If you got a shot in the leg or the arm, simplest solution was just to cut it off. Soldiers died from other things like intestinal diseases, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, measles, chickenpox, and so on, malaria, bad food, unsanitary conditions, venereal disease. The 3 worst disease killers, were typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia. Now, soldiers did try to entertain themselves in the camp, and some of the things that they did do, if it were summertime, weather was warm, they would sit around the campfire, write diaries, which is good because without their doing that, we would not know all this stuff today. Write letters home, read newspapers, read cheap novels, read the Bible, read the camp newspaper if there was one. Music was important. There would be amateur theaters, glee clubs. Sometimes they would bowl using cannonballs, the small 6-pound cannonball for 10 pins. Play cricket, play cards, play baseball, things of that sort. Musical instruments used in the military. Drums were very important because drums transmitted military movements. You'd get drums at reveille, breakfast, roll call, sick call, battle maneuvers, and here's where the drummer boys were used. In the cavalry, you used a bugle, and we all know that from watching Westerns. An Army regiment was entitled to have a band, And as I looked down the roster of Salem people, for example, I noticed that there were some people who enlisted and it said musician, musician. So every company had a certain number of musicians and they would make up the regimental band. Individual instruments also went with the soldiers. The piccolo, the flute, guitar, banjo, fiddles, harmonica. Now the use of the bugle was important, and I don't know whether you've ever heard the story of taps. Anybody ever heard how taps came about? Got one person. A Union soldier by the name of Captain Robert Ellicombe was near Harrison's Landing in Virginia one night, and he heard, after battle, he heard someone moaning out on the battlefield. He didn't know whether it was a Union soldier or a Confederate soldier, but he went out, found the person, and dragged him back to the Union lines near the fire. And when he got there, he realized that the person had died. And then when he got close to the fire, he also realized that it was his son. His son had been going to school in the South. And without his knowing it, his son had enlisted in the Confederate Army. So he went to the commanding officer and said, "Can I have a band? I want to hold a funeral for my son." And he was turned down. He said, "But we'll give you an instrument. What instrument do you want? We'll give you one instrument." And he said, "Give me the bugle." He had found on his son's person some musical notes. His son was studying music in college. And so he asked the bugler to play those notes, and that song became Taps, as we know it today. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about music. Music was instrumental, no pun intended. Music was instrumental in arousing the emotions of people in the North who were anti-slavery, who wanted to abolish the laws allowing slavery. It really didn't start during the Civil War, though. The sentiment against slavery began back in the 1772s. One person in particular, John Newton, who was a slave ship captain, realizing that slavery was wrong after having delivered ships and shiploads of slaves, left the captaincy and became an Anglican priest. And to describe his epiphany, he wrote a song called Amazing Grace. And we all know Amazing Grace because that's what we sing today in many of our events. But moving along, we get into the era I call the Stephen Foster era of the 1800s. And Stephen Foster, probably the most influential composer of our times during that period, because Stephen Foster wrote hundreds of songs deploring the plight of the American Negro. And he wrote other songs. He wrote spiritual, sentimental songs of home, sob songs, love songs, and hymns that were performed in homes and churches and schools. And in theaters, with groups or by groups like the Christy Minstrels. How many of you people have heard the new Christy Minstrels? Any of you remember them? Well, they patterned themselves after the Christy Minstrels, except they did not sing their stuff in blackface. During the 1800s, minstrel shows were very popular, and blackface was the routine that was done at that time. Julia Ward Howe, who only wrote one song, but was a terrific advocate for women's rights, wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic after visiting Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. with her husband. And that's a song that we're going to sing at the end of this program tonight. Okay, well again, I thank you for coming, and feel free to stay and visit and to look at any of the exhibits that you have, or I do have some of these sources here if you want to look at them. I'd be happy to show them to you. So.
Thank you.